My name is Lionel Tiger, and I'm a professor of anthropology in the graduate school at Rutgers University, and have been concerned with some of the more general questions about the motivation and formation of human behaviors. This tape is about why people kill each other. I'd like to begin with a quote from Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. This is the quote. "I think about my education sometimes. I went to the University of Chicago for a while after the Second World War. I was a student in the Department of Anthropology. At that time, they were teaching that there was absolutely no difference between anybody. They may be teaching that still. Another thing they taught was that nobody was ridiculous or bad or disgusting. Shortly before my father died, he said to me, 'You know, you never wrote a story with a villain in it.' I told him that was one of the things I learned in college after the war." There is among a number of the social sciences, including my own, which is roughly between anthropology and sociology, and possibly even in psychiatry, a reluctance to deal fully with the problems of aggression, not so much in the individual private sense, but in the corporate sense, the organizational sense, in the sense of how communities decide to carry on their affairs, how they protect themselves, defend themselves, how they see themselves as communities. Because it appears that as a species, we seem constantly surprised by violence and by corporate aggressive behavior. We are constantly shocked, morally outraged at the fact that humans commit aggressive behavior. However, I would like in this cassette and in talking with four persons expert in the understanding of aggressive and violent behavior in various forms, try to look at this whole question of moral outrage and look at what may be a need for a somewhat more medical, almost, approach to aggressive behavior, as if aggressive behavior was a kind of behavioral cancer. And the cure for that behavioral cancer will have to come from a deep and unsentimental look at the process of cancerous growth at the most parsimonious level, and that may have to be, of course, at the genetic level. But we have to begin with a general concern about the species. We have to look in a time of increasing density of population, of psychological reciprocity between people, of decreased distance between people in a variety of ways. We have to begin looking at the problem on a species-wide basis, because in fact that's the nature of the problem, and any solution to that problem will probably have to come from that kind of very generous perspective. Not only a generous perspective, but a difficult one, because we're not normally accustomed to seeing ourselves as a species. And yet, of course, since it's clear in the Darwinian sense we are descendants of a process of evolution and selection which has gone on for millions of years, and we have to take that into account, and we may have to also take into account some of the implications of being biological creatures. If we look at human aggressive behavior, we see that it is almost universally a male phenomenon. Now, there are some cases in which females participate under situations of duress, but by and large, overwhelmingly, the prosecution of violent and aggressive behavior is a male matter. Now, we have evidence about some of the hormonal bases of aggressive behavior in other animals and in humans, and here we can see that this is highly correlated with male hormonal characteristics. Is this male aggressive behavior as much a result of our evolution as an animal as the fact that we have hormones at all? Can we begin to look, as it were, at the phylogeny of aggressive behavior to ask if there is something intrinsic to being a human male which makes aggression as somewhat more likely than, for example, among human females? And can we go on from there to look at adult males as opposed to females and ask if in this biological phenomenon of being male or female we can try to identify one of the causes of violence? I stress one of the causes here because clearly we're never dealing with a one-to-one relationship. We're always dealing with a variety of factors. I'll be talking with a feminist who is concerned with machismo, who is interested in why males fight, in particular because she's interviewing persons concerned, for example, with the Vietnam War, and here the whole question of male identity becomes very strong. I'll be talking with a psychiatrist who's concerned with the neurophysiology and the hormonal bases of aggressive behavior, and who's worked with both humans and subhuman primates. I'll be talking with a sociologist very concerned with the implicit violence in the class structure. And I'll be talking with a philosopher, a student of the philosophy of Hegel and a writer of critiques, analyses of Hegel's books. I will not try to deal with the things which will be of direct interest to psychiatrists because I'm not competent to do so. Yet, one always has to frame the problems of psychiatric treatment in terms of a larger context. In any event, as scientists and as persons concerned with the therapies that result from scientific exploration, we have to explore. And I'd like now to begin this exploration with our four people. I'm speaking now with J. Glenn Gray, who's a philosopher, or as he prefers to be known, called a student of philosophy at Colorado College and the author of The Warriors, which is an autobiographical reflection on being in the Second World War. All adolescents, Glenn, talk about having a philosophy of life. Is there, in fact, a professional philosophy of killing?
I think not. Philosophers have done very little in this area. I've even neglected until very recently the topic of violence generally. It was always strange to me that more students of philosophy in World War II didn't do what I tried to do, to reflect on killing and on violent behavior of human beings.
Why do you think they were so unreflective?
There's a great temptation to forget such horrors, and it's more or less understood in our culture that if one talks too much about war experiences, there's bad taste, it is kind of boasting, being an old veteran, and so on. I was conscious of this in writing The Warriors, but as I think I mentioned there, I was afraid to forget because of the danger of repetition. A danger that has come to be, of course, a reality in the 1960s and 70s.
You've written both movingly and constructively about being part of a destructive group. What was so surprising about being part of a destructive group?
I think we know ourselves much too little. I was constantly surprised at how different group man is from individual man. Many people who were decent enough as persons, as individuals, when they became part of a combat unit, became almost unrecognizable. I think I spoke of it in terms of being outside themselves. The old word is ecstasy, of course, and there is a kind of ecstasy of violence and killing as truly as an ecstasy of love. One forgets himself and becomes possessed with the spirit of destruction. I simply believe that there is such a delight in destruction as truly as there's a delight in construction or in building, in making. And this kind of being outside of oneself is simply living for the immediate, exciting moment and being part of a unit, being part of a group, so that one's own death becomes incidental and forgotten. I was always struck by the German term that men don't die in battle, they fall. And this notion of simply falling covers up the fact that death is very personal, so that it's an ecstasy that causes forgetfulness of one's possible ending. And it's an ecstasy in the sense that one is wild with excitement. People love to get out of the routine of daily life and to be swept up in emotions, probably not too different from other kinds of ecstasies like religious, as I've mentioned already, like the ecstasy of love, of physical love. I'm afraid that war is a very human institution. It's only in recent times that it's become inhuman because of its indiscriminate destruction of competence and of non-competence. We like to think that in the former kinds of wars there was a much more humane attitude. It was a selective kind of destruction, whereas in the modern time, especially since World War II, it's become so technological that there is no longer any discrimination practiced.
Thomas Saz has talked about the manufacture of madness, and it occurs to me as you speak that we may have here something like the manufacture of evil by professional people who create the possibility for evil. Is that real perception, or is that just a coward's or a pacifist's conception of the matter?
I'm not familiar with that, but it seems to me that to talk about the manufacture of evil is perhaps a little remote from reality. These people are not consciously manufacturing evil. They are, in some sense, all too innocent. I mean by that, all too unaware of what they are doing and what they are making.
Then what on earth are they doing?
The usual thing, defending the concept of nationalism, defending their country, believing that their particular country has a God-given right.
The studies by Samuel Stauffer and others of the American soldier during the Second World War revealed that, in a way, contrary to what you suggested about the importance of patriotism in motivating people to war, that on the ground, at any rate, soldiers fought for their buddies. Their chief loyalty was to their immediate group. In that context, one wonders if this loyalty is part of a general psychic process, and perhaps war is a much more effective stimulus for loyalty than, say, peace.
Yes, I'm afraid that has to be granted, but in reference to the World War II, fighting for one's buddies, I think this was at the conscious level the motivating power. But most American soldiers had the very strong feeling that Hitler had to be stopped, and that at an unconscious level, patriotism was still a very powerful force, in contrast apparently to Vietnam, where none of this obtained, where personal survival was the only real motivating power. Hence so many atrocities, everything done to keep yourself alive. In World War II, many American soldiers were, at least for a time, able to forget the all-importance of their own personal survival.
Is there a kind of personality that enjoys war or enjoys just being antagonistic?
Yes, I think so. There are some people who are simply gung-ho about any kind of action, the kind of people who love football and love the brutal sport. They aren't, so far as I'm aware, personally mean or in other relations brutal. I think one has to be careful here. There are people who enjoy war. They are not necessarily antagonistic or equipped with qualities that we in civilian life have learned are counterproductive.
We live in a culture which refuses, or at least doesn't, pay great heed to the problem of violence and the possibility of aggressive behavior. What are some of the practical consequences of that which you observe as a citizen, as a teacher?
That we are always surprised when these outbreaks occur. We're always not only surprised but unprepared. There seems to be a kind of conspiracy of silence, not unrelated to the fact that Americans don't like to talk about death, at least until recently, when death has become an in subject. We like to be, as a people, optimistic, believing that certain hardiness and cheerfulness about the future is important to our psychic health. This seems to be part of the reason, at any rate, why violence and death and killing are so little reflected upon.
Thank you very much, Glenn Gray. Lucy Komisar is a writer of articles and books and currently involved in a burgeoning project which is also very important, which is a study of what Lucy calls the machismo factor. That is to say, the factor of a certain kind of behavior in a more general set of behaviors. Lucy, why do you think people bother to kill each other?
I've been in Washington recently talking to people who have been in the Defense Department, in the State Department, in the White House, everybody from a former Secretary of War to an aide to Henry Kissinger. A lot of what I've discovered is that the issue itself is less important than the question of the challenge that's involved, the feeling that we have to show our credibility, that we can't show ourselves as weak, that we have to prove ourselves, that we have to be tough, that we're being challenged, that we're being tested. The place of the testing is almost less important. It could be Vietnam, as it's been, or it could be someplace else, and that doesn't even matter. What matters is that we're being challenged and tested, and we've got to show that we're tough. And part of that toughness is the willingness to use force and the willingness to kill. And people who have been advisors to Kissinger and to McNamara and to Bundy told me that to be soft was to challenge the killing and to talk about death and to talk about the human problem of killing people who are soft. And I think that in foreign policy, one also looks down on people as soft and somehow feminine if they're concerned about the real life effects of killing. Stevenson, who was against bomb testing, who was in favor of negotiation and efforts to not show how tough we were, was considered soft. People used to make jokes about, oh, he's all right to take Jackie to the opera, but he wasn't part of the group that made decisions in the Pentagon. Well, I think Western culture, American culture, and I don't want to talk about others because I'm not investigating them, but it may as well be true of many other cultures. These cultures have told men that manhood is dependent on power, domination, control, strength, sometimes violence, power over men, power over women equally, and this desire to prove their manhood becomes then translated, if they get into positions of power in the nation, into efforts to exert their power over other countries and efforts to prove themselves. Sometimes one feels that the Kennedys and the Johnsons and the Nixons were proving their own personal strength and power and manhood against the Russians or whoever it might be, the Cubans, rather than trying to work out a way of living with another country. They're only beginning to exist among the people who are in positions of national decision-making. The understanding of the pressure that they are under. I talked with John Kenneth Galbraith, who talked to me about the Cuban crisis, the Bay of Pigs, how everybody was trying to show how tough they were, how here we got into what President Kennedy later couldn't believe we had gotten into, an incredible situation. He said, how do we get into this? And I don't think he ever really understood. And yet somebody like Galbraith, and also the books by Sorensen and Schlesinger, both talk about how the people who were involved in that decision-making process were afraid to say that, well, you know, we really shouldn't invade this other country. That became a proof of weakness, and they were all caught up in this.
You've been involved as a citizen in a number of very important feminist activities in this country, and very successfully so. Do you relate your work on the machismo factor to this other attention to the violence that you feel is committed against females?
Well, sure. Power over women has always been one of the ways that men have been able to prove their manhood. And we only have to look at the mythology and the jokes about things like henpecked husbands to see what society thinks of men who don't have power over women. There isn't a comparable phrase to describe rooster-pecked wives, because that is supposed to be the standard and the natural. And so a man that doesn't have power over his wife is put down and ridiculed. And so it becomes very much a part of it. Women are the prime victims of the machismo factor, and yet men in society are also victims of it. We're probably more visible victims, and men who are not able to exert their manhood by dominating other men and by being important and powerful in society at large find their last resort in dominating women. It's an easier thing to do, and it's the last possibility they may have of proving their manhood, so then we become the victims of it.
Are females exempt from this form of violence and horror?
I'm not saying that there are not women who are people who want to exert power and dominance and control. The difference is that normally men seek to establish their masculinity and women seek to establish their femininity. American culture and Western culture has defined femininity in ways that are quite different than manhood, whereas manhood may be described as the exertion of dominance, power, aggression. Femininity has been defined as something that has to do with submissiveness, passiveness, sensitivity, certainly not power. So to prove your femininity does not mean that one has to show how tough you are in the face of making decisions that may result in people being killed. That is perhaps why, if women were in positions of power in foreign policy and in national politics, there would not be these personal tests involved. I think they might be more ready and able to compromise and to think of the reality involved in terms of the benefit of the country rather than as something which was to prove themselves and to prove their own power.
Well, let's take two propositions, which both may be true. One is that among the other primates, because we're similar to them, we find that by and large males are more aggressive, dominating, hostile, bellicose than females, as a regular rule. And secondly, that what you say about in our culture might also apply to in other cultures. Now, if you were a therapist in Zanzibar or in Thailand, and you had a situation which was related to the ones you've been describing, would you look for something in the machismo factor which wasn't just the American factor or the Western factor? I'm really trying here to get to a medical base.
I haven't investigated culture in other civilizations, but I think that if we looked in the cultures of other countries, we might see also non-functional decisions that are made by national leaders, which have to do with their own personal reactions.
Doesn't this mean that there may be some very important sex differences across cultures which somehow get used in such a way as to put males under this kind of ridiculous stress and forces females out of a situation where they can experience this stress?
I think that unless we get to the position where women are in these positions of decision-making, we won't really know how they would react. The question of whether it's cultural or biological is still so difficult to decide because we're not in a position where women have shared this kind of power with men. So I don't know whether it's cultural, whether it's biological, or whether it's a little bit of both. And if it's biological, I'm particularly concerned about how we can change it. If it's cultural, perhaps we can come to change through education. If it's biological, then we certainly have to take other kinds of steps, and I don't think that perhaps that this has been something that we've considered enough. When we get to biology, I think we're a little more afraid of what we can do. Are we going to give everybody shots to make them less bellicose? There's been the great debates now about the use of brain surgery to change people who have been violent and bellicose. We've accepted much more the notion that it's all right to educate people and almost to brainwash people in a national sense to act in certain ways. But I think there's much more of a fear of using medical and physical methods of changing people's attitudes.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy Komisar. I'm talking with Dr. Arthur Kling, who's professor of psychiatry at the Rutgers Medical School and who's had considerable experience in researching and publishing material about the physiological concomitants of human violence and primate violence. Arthur, what is the state of our understanding about the physiological concomitants of violence?
In the past 20 years, there's been a great deal of work done on brain function and behavior, some of which is directly related to aggressive behavior, others only peripherally. The problem is that most of the studies that have been done up to now, in animal work certainly, have dealt with animals in highly unfavorable environments for the expression of naturally occurring aggressive behavior. As a result, much of what we know about the physiology of violence with respect to brain function may in fact not be operable in the natural world of the animal. So this is a problem in translating some of the physiological data into the real world. Much of the work, however, that has been done on brain function is focused on a couple of areas of the brain, primarily the limbic structures and hypothalamic structures. Probably the most important of the limbic structures with respect to aggressive behavior is the amygdaloid nucleus, which lies in the medial surface of the temporal lobe. The structure itself has been known to affect a wide variety of behaviors ever since the pioneering work of Cleaver and Busey in the late 30s, and then Dr. Schreiner and myself in the early 50s found that in fact this nucleus was extremely important in the regulation of aggressive behavior. Essentially, when you remove it in most animal species, you get a reduction in aggressive behavior, a reduction in response to threat and aggressive behavior by subjects who may be threatening the animal, and indeed, over time, one gets a whole variety of other behavioral effects, such as an increase in sexual behavior, an increase in oral investigative behavior. When you stimulate this area of the brain, in contrast to the reduction of aggression with lesions, you get an increase in aggressive behavior. And this is highly automatic. Just turning on the juice will produce an animal that will show all the concomitants of aggression, including the vocal and autonomic nervous system responses. Now, there has also been some work done on lesions of the amygdaloid nucleus in man. This was started, in a sense, by Nariyabashi in Japan, who for the past 10 years has been producing small localized lesions in the amygdaloid nucleus of severely aggressive, retarded children whose behavior cannot be controlled by drugs and who have to be institutionalized, and while in institutions have tremendous managerial problems. They frequently have to be physically restrained in order to control their destructive behavior. Nariyabashi claims that small selective lesions, the amygdaloid nucleus bilaterally, effectively reduce these outbursts of aggression and violence in these children and make them more amenable to training, learning, and many of whom can go home and live in an environment with their families where previously they were restricted to a hospital situation. Now, the other areas of the brain that have been involved in aggressive behavior also include the hippocampus, which is essentially the major portion of the limbic structures, and hypothalamic structures. When the ventromedial nucleus, which lies in the mid-tuberal region of the hypothalamus, is destroyed, cats or monkeys become extremely hyperaggressive. The animals are almost unmanageable by usual handling means. In addition, however, to the hyperaggression that's displayed, they also show metabolic effects such as hyperphagia and obesity. Now, it is interesting that the amygdaloid nucleus projects directly into the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus, so that one has a limbic hypothalamic projection system, which undoubtedly is important in the regulation of aggression. Because after all, no one structure could possibly be influential in the regulation of any complex behavior. It has to do with neural systems. In addition to the amygdala, the hypothalamus also receives projections from the frontal lobe, and so does the amygdala. Dr. Wallenauta at Massachusetts Institute of Technology has published in the past 5 years a series of studies which has shown rather direct connections between the amygdaloid nucleus, the thalamus, and the frontal lobe. So we're beginning to see a kind of circuitry which may be important in the total regulation of this very complex behavior. As far as hormones are concerned, it's still not very clear what the role of estrogens are. In some of the earlier experiments some years ago, high levels of estrogen were known to produce heightened levels of aggression, especially in females, while in males tends to lower the degree of aggression. It's also been used as a treatment for lowering tension levels in males who suffer from cardiac problems and hypertension. Unfortunately, the side effects of a loss of libido and feminization of the secondary sexual characteristics are too strong to really consider it as a major therapeutic measure.
How then would that affect, for example, our conception of sex differences among humans, as far as aggressive behavior is concerned?
Well, extremely so, because developmentally, from close to birth on, there are striking differences between the behavior of males and females. And these are subject to alteration by the application of either exogenous hormones during the neonatal period or even during the prenatal period. Dr. Goy and his colleagues, previously at Oregon and now at Wisconsin, have shown very dramatically the alteration not only in aggressive behavior but in other behaviors which are characteristic or specific to the sexes in monkeys during the early developmental stages, such as play behavior, relationship to peers, relationship to adults, so that if one, for example, feminizes a male early in life, you get a reduction in the early rough and tumble play phase of behavior. And conversely, if you masculinize a female, you get a large increase in the aggressive behavior and rough and tumble play of the females. This is quite distinct, and I think the evidence is quite good for this. So that early in development, there is a fixation of hypothalamic structures which determine the hormone levels that are going to occur later in life. And these are going to be influential in the development of the secondary sexual characteristics as well as distinct behavioral characteristics specific to males and females. Alteration of these early in life are going to change them. Of course, there are genetic bases for this, and Dr. Money and his colleagues at Hopkins have shown that in congenital abnormalities, where in fact there are disturbances in gonadal development, hermaphrodites, and instances where there is a disruption of gonadal development, both in males and females, this is reflected in the behavior of these children as they're growing up.
Well, thank you very much, Arthur Kling. I'm talking with Richard Sennett, who's been at the New York University Department of Sociology and is now at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton as a fellow. Richard, we're interested in the sources of violence in individuals, in social structure, and even in the definition of violence. And I wondered, from your own work with people in this community, how you see violence as a part of the body sociological.
Well, I think it's an innate part of it. I think you really have to define what you mean by that term to understand why it's innate. Legal violence, of course, is sanctioned by the state. And by that we would mean just the physical assault of someone else by people who are empowered for that. But I think there's another way to look at that, which is the almost etymological relationship between the word violence and the word violation. What does that mean? If this is a society that sanctions what we would call violations of other people in some way, whether they be physical violations or what I think is more endemic, emotional violations of other people, then I think we could say that the whole society is built on a kind of violence. Then one has to ask, what do we mean by a violation of someone else? As I've thought about it, I've thought about two different ways to define that. One would be a simple one of saying that you violate somebody else by restricting their freedom of movement or judgment. So we do violence to someone if we make it difficult for someone who's come to New York City to register for welfare until after they've lived in a city a year. We restrict their movement and in a way violate their freedom of action in order for them to get some kind of basic support from the state. That's one way to look at it. And another way to look at it, which I think probably would be more interesting in this context, is to talk about the idea of, are there such things as psychic rights? And when those rights are violated, then one person does violence to someone else. Now, that's a hard concept to deal with, because the question of what a person deserves emotionally becomes either very trivial or very, very complicated. What is it that defines the kinds of demands, the kinds of rights, the kinds of innate possessions that someone would have, the transgressing of which would be an act of violence? So I think that everybody has the emotional right to exist in a certain kind of a climate, in a certain kind of society in which their own strengths and their own weaknesses don't totally determine whether they sink or swim in the society. That the issue of a person's survival shouldn't totally depend on their own resources. And that any society that casts a person into the role of being independent is doing a kind of violence to them, because it's a really kind of hidden form of omnipotence. On use as a disorder, I talk about this in terms of community life and the fact that so much in white middle-class community life, so much respect is accorded to people who are able to do without other people, that in effect what we do is put a premium on the one hand for people living in isolation, and at the same time, by that very fact, we do an enormous violence to their needs for other people, or to their feeling that they ought to be able to need other people.
You're suggesting, in effect, that violence is almost circumstantial to any form of social difference which is based on class.
Right.
And in The Hidden Injuries of Class, your book, you imply that in the title. You give away the plot in the title, as it were.
Right.
And one wonders, therefore, if, for example, again, psychiatrists dealing with patients as individuals may not be aware of the real structure of violence within which people live. But I wonder if, even for therapeutic reasons, one hasn't to expand the concept of violence to involve a much larger membrane, if you will, that can be severed than we normally think of.
Well, I think we do, and I think that also poses a therapeutic problem. For instance, if it's true for working class people that they feel that continually they're violated by upper middle class and particularly professional people, because as people told me, those intellectuals and professionals think they can judge you and know what's going on with you, but you can't understand them. I remember one quote with their shrinks and all of that, that they're just too complicated. And that kind of difference in imagery between what the classes are, that educated professional people in a way have a kind of inner power over the average worker, means that worker feels that at any moment he's very, very vulnerable to being violated. Now that could come out in very paranoid feelings, and it does. The origins of that paranoia are in something totally outside that individual's making, and yet he has to live with that as a problem. So to get back to the violence part of it, I think that the way in which people can feel violated emotionally is quite inclusive, that as you say, the membrane's much larger than it would first appear. And I think that a lot of what we describe as irrational violence, mob violence, or violence of white working class communities, it has a kind of rational source, or an understandable source. It's not just the mob, but there's a tremendous amount of anger against being treated like nothing. That kind of sense of being violated in turn sets up all kinds of conditions for physical violence against the outside world to push it out so that it won't violate that space.
On the other hand, for all of us whose job it is to diagnose, it's very easy to pick on the pathos of the world and to illustrate how dismal and how ill-organized it is. But again, therapists have a more constructive function, allegedly. How does one set about creating a social structure so that people don't come in private to physicians with these kinds of wounds you've been describing?
That's a good question. As I've thought about it, I can think about two kinds of social situations in which this kind of wounding is removed. One of them is play, and the other is putting people into situations where they're not working for a reward. And it's often seemed to me that the play element in a lot of work is very much neglected. The sense of playing at, doing something almost competitive. One of the things that's done in China very frequently, and that supposedly very non-competitive society, is for cadres of workers to compete against each other to complete a task and so on. And there's no reward for that, it's just play. And from what little we know about that kind of experience, it does seem to relieve the onus. This goes on in a situation where bureaucrats and college people have been moved out into the countryside, And there's a way of getting people to work with each other without those social differences counting too much. That kind of playing works. I think that's a relatively minor issue to a much larger issue, which is how one begins to think about actions that take place in and of themselves and not for reward. I mean, it seems to me that the ultimate violation that's practiced on all people in this society is that all action becomes a means to something else, right? That we work in order to be promoted. So what I'm talking about is when one tries to think about how one diminishes the sources of that sense of violation, in a way what you have to think about are ways in which this society could be restructured so that people don't feel that the actions they take in the community or at the workplace are means to something else, to getting ahead, and so on. I think if that were pursued far enough, that we could come out with a different set of proposals for what ought to be changed in society than the ones that we've traditionally operated on. Let me give an example of that. It's always seemed to me that the stuff that people did in the 60s on job hiring, for instance, was intensified the very conditions they wanted to remove. Because if you talk about giving people equal opportunities, you're talking about giving people equal opportunities to test themselves, right? And the more people have a chance to test themselves in a hierarchical society, the more chance there is for people to experience a great deal of failure. If the end is that by that testing, people get a richer economic and social life, why not provide those ends immediately and forget about a structure of kind of an equal chance to be rewarded if only you will perform, where the performing itself gets to be a very anxiety-laden, and predestined in a society like this. Failure determined experience, the majority. But what I'm trying to say is that what's built into the fabric is kind of individualism, which is not aggressive, but always inward turning. That's the way in which the society does violence to the people who are within it. It intensifies that sense to try and validate the self by performing. And that's usually through some kind of demonstration of exceptional success by standing out as an individual.
Well, I suppose, though, you could make much the same kind of argument about piety in certain Oriental cultures, or self-abnegation, or austerity in the Puritan conscience. And I wonder if we're not dealing here with a form of self-distancing which may go beyond mere capitalism or mere communism. It really has to do with human relations in the most Zamilian sense,
Well, I think it's a question of, what the community picks up when the individual fails. I mean, if you look at the support systems that exist in this society for when a person feels like they're in trouble, it's to go see the doctor, the middle class, right? In which case something is going to be rearranged inside, right? Or to get very kinds of impersonal kind of bureaucratic aid. What's missing is some sense of community that operates at that point where every individual feels that he's weak. And that's why I started talking about that. So because I think without that sense of a community that operates precisely at the point, not where the individual is feeling a lot of brotherhood, but feeling that he can't cope, that kind of a supporting community, in a way, is more therapeutic than any kind of further inward turning could be.
Thank you very much, Richard Sennett. We've had a rather elaborate tour now of various people's views of why aggression and violence occur, and how and under what circumstances and with what consequences. And I think intrinsic to this discussion has been a fear, even, or a sense that perhaps the human good and the human bad are both rooted in the same social process. The same team of men and women can enter a surgery and do something useful, or they can enter a concentration camp and slaughter people. Doctors in the Second World War both protected patients and engaged in human experiments. The same process in part was involved, at least down on the ground, as it were. Is the process that leads to the good the same psychiatrically as the process that leads to the bad? When we have a war against poverty, when we have a war against Vietnamese, are we doing the same thing in all those cases? What is the different dimension which characterizes the one good process and the one bad process? Is it simply evil people who commit the bad processes? How does one make these determinations? Is to understand the problem of violence to pardon it? Of course not. But to see a different dimension of the problem. To analyze a situation is not to recommend it. It may well be that those who say that if one claims that violence is instinctive are assisting violence in the world. I doubt it personally, because it's clear that violence occurred long before ethologists and phylogeneticists and others said that violence might be part of the human condition. There was violence, there was slavery, there was exploitation, there was aggression long before Darwin, long before Spencer and the malformation of Darwin's notion that Spencer created, namely his notion of the survival of the fittest. At the same time, if we begin to see violence as purely cultural, in the cliche sense, purely a result of social conditions, then in a way that's much more problematic than the other hypothesis, because that means that that which we do best, that is to say make up cultures, we also do so badly that we create cultural reasons for war.
Produced under a grant from SmithKline and French Laboratories by the Council for Interdisciplinary Communication in Medicine, Limited.